I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the world's first known civilization, provably known civilization, ancient Sumeria, which existed in a region called Mesopotamia. The Neolithic Revolution occurred first in Mesopotamia, and so we start to see all of the hallmarks of the Neolithic Revolution: cities, stratification of labor, etc., in the land that's now known as Iraq. This is the earliest known location for farming, for the development of cities, for the development of writing, and sophisticated government. Much of what we call civilization would spread out from this region to other parts of the world. However, I should go ahead and point out that there are several parts of the world where civilization developed independently, meaning that the rise of state-level societies, of governments, of cities, of writing, of farming, that these occurred independently of one another. The first known civilization is that of ancient Sumeria, which we're talking about right now. There's also ancient Egypt, which was centered on the Nile River Valley. Ancient Sumeria was centered on the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, two parallel rivers, semi-parallel, that run through what's now known as Iraq. In the Nile River Valley in Egypt, you had a civilization emerge. You had a civilization emerge in the Indus River Valley, in what's now Pakistan and India, which is another origin of civilization. You had another civilization emerge in the Yellow River Valley in northern China, and you also had civilizations emerge in what's now southern Mexico and in the Andes Mountains of South America. As stated in our other videos on this topic, the Neolithic Revolution is centered on the development of agriculture, of intensive farming of the land to produce crops in order to feed larger and larger numbers of people. Hunter-gathering communities had to rely on game. They had to follow herds of animals or populations of other species as they moved throughout the land, and they had to rely on wild nuts, berries, etc. to find food. And this kept population numbers low. For starters, there wasn't as much nutrition available for hunter-gatherers as for farming communities. Later on, the sheer number of calories that you can produce while farming, let's say wheat in a very small plot of land, or corn in a small plot of land, much higher than you can if you're having to follow around game. On top of that, because hunter-gatherers have to follow herds of animals, and this is also true for pastoralists, who, instead of following herds of wild animals, who, like the Maasai, actually have their own herds of cattle that they lead around. But for both hunter-gatherers and pastoralists, people had to be on the move frequently. And this constant movement affected women's fertility. Women were fertile, much less fertile, having to constantly expend energy on the move. When farming began, people became more sedentary. Women were able to become pregnant much more easily and give birth much more easily. And as a result of this, combined with the increased amount of calories available for people, and the ability to cultivate vegetables and to get vitamins and minerals from those, this caused the human population to skyrocket. So agricultural societies became much more heavily populated, much more densely populated, meaning many more people on a smaller amount of land. The increase in population also resulted in an increase in productivity. Fewer people had to be involved in the process of collecting food, because food production was so labor intensive for hunter-gatherers. Everyone had to be involved in either hunting or fishing, trapping, or foraging for food. This meant that people didn't have quite the same specialization in terms of their labor that we would see in these emerging Neolithic societies. With the Neolithic Revolution, not everyone had to be involved in food production. You could have some people serving as farmers, and then you could also have people who worked as specialized craftsmen, as blacksmiths, for example, which enabled people to focus on the arts of manipulating metal, which would lead to the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age, etc. And of course, this would result in revolution after revolution technologically for humanity, because now you had people who had the time and the resources to focus solely on solving problems. So you start to see specialized labor, blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, etc., people who had special skills. You also start to see religious specialists, priests, scribes, and this would lead to the development of writing, in which you had even further specialization, since in early Neolithic societies, as writing developed, not everyone had access to this knowledge. Only a very small number of people could read and write in these early civilizations. As stated in a previous lecture, these kinds of early civilizations developed in river valleys. For example, the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys in Mesopotamia, the Nile River Valley in Egypt. And the reason for this is because the rivers would deposit silt. The rivers would flood, and they would deposit mineral-rich soil, silt, into the land surrounding the river, the deltas of the rivers. For example, the Mississippi River Delta in the United States is the second most fertile soil on earth, because the Mississippi River deposits nutrient-rich soil in Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, etc., Tennessee. And so that soil is very, very, very good. So you have the rivers depositing this very fertile silt in which early farmers could easily grow lots of food. The problem was that the silt was deposited by flooding, and these floods could be very violent of these rivers. So for people to make use of the farmland to its maximum extent, they had to have flood control. So they had to have people building dams, bridges, etc., so that they could control the flow of water. On top of that, in more arid regions like Mesopotamia and Egypt, you had to maintain irrigation canals. Irrigation is the technology of moving water from one location to another. And this usually involved digging a series of ditches so that water would flow from the rivers into the drier parts of the soil and would thus make previously unusable land arable, meaning you can grow crops on it. And so these irrigation ditches, the hundreds of irrigation ditches that had to be dug in these ancient city-states required a massive amount of very demanding, back-breaking labor. And people just didn't go out and dig irrigation ditches with stone tools for their health. They had to be either coerced or rewarded by very powerful people for this to happen. So as these societies become more complex, as labor becomes more stratified, as more food is grown, more and more intricate irrigation systems are needed. And so what this meant was that very small numbers of people in these early civilizations began to accumulate vast amounts of power. This is how, for example, the pharaohs of Egypt began. Strong men who could use military force to maintain order, to force people to work on irrigation systems, to protect irrigation systems, to protect property, because if your property wasn't protected, then you had no interest in participating in civic life, in the life of the community. And so strong men were needed who could rule with an iron fist, right? And this is where we see the beginnings of the early kings, the kings of the various city-states of ancient Sumeria. So what was Sumeria? Well, Sumeria was the southern region of Mesopotamia. If you're familiar with the Iraq War from about 20 years ago, it's the region that was controlled by the British during the Iraq War, the early phase of the Iraq War, southern Iraq. And Sumeria is where people called the Sumerians built a number of different kingdoms based around city-states. So you have these kind of independent cities and the surrounding countryside, the surrounding farmland, all ruled by a king, and they often warred with one another. These kings had to be strong to protect the irrigation systems, to maintain property, etc. Their rule could often be very harsh, and they would make war against one another. However, with the establishment of cities like and Uruk, etc., in ancient Mesopotamia, you start to see great technological progress. One of the inventions that is so critical for the future of humanity was the wheel. Early on, wheels began to be used as kind of curiosities with toys and other small objects. But over time, larger wheels began to be made that were used to move heavy loads. And eventually from the wheel, you will have the wheelbarrow, which revolutionized agriculture. You also have other critical inventions like the potter's wheel. With the wheel leads to the development of the potter's wheel, which made the production of pottery, which was also first developed in Mesopotamia, much, much easier. So having pots to store grain, to store vegetables, etc., made life much, much, much easier than before people had access to that. But you also have the first number system, written number system that allowed for writing down mathematics. You have the sundial, you have the sail, which allowed for goods to be moved along the Tigris and Euphrates River into the Persian Gulf, and you have the plow. And the plow, of course, is critical because you didn't just have to use the hoes that were common at the time. You could now employ animal muscle to plow your field, which made the act of plowing much, 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 much more effective. The Sumerians developed a writing system called cuneiform, in which scribes would use reeds to make wedge-like marks on clay. And where the wedge-like marks were made determined what was written. So for the first time, governments could keep records, religious texts could be written down, and people could communicate over long distances. So this is really the first truly literate society. The kings of the early city-states maintained their rule through fielding armies, but also through the use of religion. So a new class of priests emerged in these ancient city-states, and the priests were considered vital because they maintained the favor of the gods. If the gods were displeased with the people, then disaster would result. Natural disasters, famines, poor harvests, locusts, droughts, etc., that could be detrimental to society. So it was very important to placate the gods, especially the ancient Sumerian gods, because they were very, very, very unforgiving towards humanity. In the ancient Sumerian religion, the gods and goddesses would, like with the ancient Greek gods, take out their wrath on their human subjects without much hesitation. They had to be placated and kept from pouring out their wrath onto the land. So it was very important that the worship of the gods was conducted correctly, according to the religious beliefs at the time, which meant that a class of specialized priests had to emerge. And these priests, of course, were the literate element of society. So they controlled written communication, and they would often serve as a support system for the kings and the nobility to maintain order, law and order, and their rule over. Another tool of the kings was monumental architecture, and this is something we will see throughout the ancient world. The construction of large buildings signified where the power lay, right? And the power lies in the king. The king can construct these monumental buildings that would dwarf anything that the individual person could ever hope to construct. And so it was a kind of visceral reminder of who was in control. For the ancient Sumerian kings of the different city-states, the giant ziggurats were the epitome of monumental architecture. The ziggurats were huge step pyramids built out of mud brick, which usually at the top you would have a palace and a temple, and the priests would conduct sacrifices at the very top, and the kings would also make the laws there. And these were in the center of the giant cities, and they were a sign of who was really in control. And of course, it took a great amount of labor and resources, and also engineering knowledge to create these structures. So the kings had a lot of motivation to produce these. The ancient Sumerian city-states were ruled by individual kings. They often warred with one another, and no one king had power over the entire region. This changed with the emergence of Sargon of Akkad. Sargon wasn't Sumerian, he was an Akkadian, which was a Semitic nation of people who lived in northern Mesopotamia. We use the term Semitic, meaning that they spoke an ancient Semitic language, meaning they share a same common ancestry with the Hebrews, the Assyrians, the Arabs, etc. They have a common root language that their language descended from. He was an outsider. He was completely foreign to the Sumerians. But he conquered their various city-states and united them under himself. And he created the world's first truly multi-ethnic empire, meaning multiple tribes of people with different languages, with different religions, living under one government. And so Sargon ruled as king of Akkad, of the Akkadian Empire, in the 24th century BC. And he was a very, very powerful ruler. The story of his life is one of the kind of early biographical epics. When he was a baby, he was put on according to his biographer, he was put in a basket of reeds and sent down the Euphrates River. This is an element that would be used when in the life of Moses in the Old Testament, which the ancient Hebrews were related to the Akkadians. This particular element was something that they shared in common. In fact, the ancient patriarch Abraham came from the city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia. Abraham is, of course, the founder of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and the founder of both the Hebrews and the Arabs in the Old Testament. And he originated in Mesopotamia, likely as possibly being Akkadian or from a group of people who were related to the Akkadians. So Sargon was very, very powerful. You can see in the image of his face that part of the eye is badly damaged. This is because Sargon was also very hated. So after his death, he was not, his dynasty did not last long. Sargon's heirs were not up to the task of maintaining his empire. His most intelligent child was his daughter, Enheduanna, who was a high priestess of Nana, one of the Sumerian goddesses. And she is the world's first author who is known by name. So this is a very important figure historically, just because her poetry, her hymns to the goddess she served, Nana, are a very, very, very early example of poetry in which we actually know the identity of the writer. The most important thing about Enheduanna is that through looking at her poetry, we get an idea of what the ancient Sumerian religious beliefs were. These were people who believed in gods and goddesses who were very, very harsh on the faithful, who were quick to mete out justice and quick to mete out punishment to those whom they had believed had wronged them. These were gods and goddesses who had to be placated or assuaged from bringing wrath on the earth and causing destruction for the faithful. And if we just take a look at her poetry, we can get an idea of just how vicious the moon goddess Nana could be. I'll go ahead and read a bit from The Lament to the Spirit of War by Enheduanna. Remember that this was a hymn to the moon goddess Nana, whom Enheduanna served. Nana was very, very wrathful when she was displeased, and this is a hymn about her ability to destroy, Inanna's ability to avenge herself. Rising on fearsome wings, you rush to destroy the land, descending like a raging storm, howling like a hurricane, screaming like a tempest, thundering, raging, ranting, drumming, whip-lashing whirlwinds, men falter at your approaching footsteps. So this talks about the sheer power of Inanna to destroy mankind. Tortured dirges scream on your lyre of despair. Lyre was a musical instrument. Like a fiery salamander, you poison the land, growling over the earth like thunder, vegetation collapsing before you, blood pushing down mountainsides. Spirit of hatred, greed, and vengeance, dominatrix of heaven and earth. And so this is a very, very violent deity. Your ferocious fire consumes our land. Whipping your stallion with furious commands, you decide our fate. You triumph over all human rights and prayers. So nothing can be done to save humanity. Who can explain your tirade? Why you go on so? So Inanna is not just powerful, she's also irrational. This isn't a transcendent God who is morally superior to humanity. This is a very violent person who has the power of a god in her grasp. A very different type of deity from what would develop, from what people would believe in later periods with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, etc. And of course, a deity like this, demanding satisfaction, there's an image of Nana, or Inanna, right there, the goddess served by Enheduanna. The Sumerians believed in a very harsh universe. There wasn't the kind of emphasis on forgiveness and brotherly love, etc. This was a civilization in which the pantheon of gods were very violent, very wrathful.